The satellites cover every centimeter of Australia, every dried-out lakebed, every eroded gully, every unmarked track cutting across the red interior. The technology is precise, the coverage is total, and yet, there are people living in that land who don't appear on any official map. Not because the satellites failed, because someone, very deliberately, made sure you wouldn't know they were there. What follows isn't a list of hermits or oddballs. These are communities, organized, intentional, multi-generational in some cases, that made a collective decision to step outside the field of vision of the Australian state. Some did it quietly. Some built entire systems to make sure no one could find them. And a few, near the end of this countdown, aren't hiding at all. They're waiting for something they believe is coming, and they intend to be ready when it arrives. The question isn't where they are. The question is what happened, what the state did or failed to do, that made disappearing feel like the safer option. There's a property somewhere in Western Queensland that, by all external appearances, hasn't changed much since around 1995. The fences are maintained, the water tanks are full, the gardens are extensive and clearly tended with real care. From the road, if you can find the road, it looks like any other working property in the Mulga country. What changed in the mid-90s wasn't the land, it was a decision. A single family, then numbering perhaps 8 people, quietly disconnected from the electricity grid, then from postal services, then from any formal relationship with the state school system for children born on the property from that point forward. No dramatic announcement, no manifesto. Just a gradual, deliberate withdrawal from every service the state offered, because in their calculation, every service came with a form of surveillance attached. The family has since grown. Estimates vary, but former neighbors suggest somewhere between 30 and 50 people now live and work on that land. None of the children born there in the last 2 decades have attended a registered school. Some, it's understood, have never left the property. They're not prisoners. They simply have no reason to leave a world that, from their perspective, is already complete. What makes this place unusual isn't the isolation itself. Plenty of remote Queensland properties are functionally cut off from urban services. What's unusual is the intentionality. The decision was made, and then the decision was maintained across generations. The original family's children are now adults who are raising their own children inside the same logic. The state doesn't know how many people live there, doesn't know what they're eating, learning, or thinking. And here's what lingers. They're not asking for anything. That's not indifference. That's a verdict. At some point in the early 2000s, a small group broke away from an evangelical congregation in regional New South Wales over what from the outside looked like a minor doctrinal dispute. It wasn't minor to them. They moved inland. They established a settlement on private land, with no registered name, no incorporated body, no formal leadership structure that any external organization could identify or contact. They hold their own gatherings. They maintain their own theological calendar. And they've made a collective decision not to appear on any electoral roll, which in Australia, where voting is compulsory, is itself a kind of civic rupture. The members of this community don't appear as conscientious objectors in any official record. They don't appear as anything. They're simply absent from the list, absent from the census in any meaningful way, absent from the records of births, deaths, and marriages for events that have occurred within the community since they left. They believe, genuinely, consistently, that formal registration with the state constitutes a form of spiritual compromise, that to be named on a government document is to enter into a covenant with an authority they don't recognize. So they don't sign anything, they don't register anything, they don't notify anyone of anything. For the Australian state, these people do not vote, do not fall ill, do not die. They exist outside every administrative category the government uses to understand its own population. There's something quietly staggering about that, if you sit with it for a moment. This one took some work to piece together, because the people involved built it well. A group of former technology and infrastructure professionals, engineers, systems architects, network specialists, began, in the mid-2010s, to quietly acquire adjacent parcels of land in the mid-north of South Australia. They did it through separate entities, nothing that would flag as a single coordinated purchase. Over several years, the parcels were consolidated and developed into a settlement that is, by any technical measure, genuinely self-sufficient. Solar and wind generation, water collection and purification at scale, food production sophisticated enough to sustain the community through extended drought, medical supplies and trained personnel, communications infrastructure that doesn't depend on commercial networks. The irony, and it's hard to ignore, is that these are people who spent their careers building the systems that keep modern Australia connected. They didn't leave because they failed. They left because they understood from the inside exactly how fragile what they'd built actually was. They'd seen the single points of failure. They'd seen the decisions made for profit over resilience. They'd seen what would happen to the network if certain things went wrong. And they built a place where those things going wrong wouldn't matter. They don't call themselves preppers. They find that word reductive. They'd call themselves, if they'd talk to you at all, which they won't, pragmatists. What they knew that the rest of us didn't is the part that stays with you. More than 200 kilometers from the nearest sealed road, there is, or there may be, a settlement that exists in a genuinely peculiar legal condition. The settlement has been there, in various forms, for at least 15 years. People live there permanently. Children have been born there. People have died there. But the access route, a dry season track passable only in specific conditions, has meant that the standard mechanisms of state administration have never reached it in any consistent way. Here's the part that matters. Children born in that settlement over the past decade and a half have not, in many cases, been registered with births, deaths, and marriages in the Northern Territory. They exist. They're alive. They're growing up, being educated in whatever way the community has arranged. But on the official register, they were never born. They have no birth certificates, no Medicare numbers, no tax file numbers waiting to be issued when they come of age. They are, in the strictest legal sense, people who do not officially exist within the jurisdiction they were born in. This isn't an oversight on the state's part. The settlement's location is known in a general sense to some local government officials. But the formal process of registration requires physical presence, paperwork, and a level of engagement with state systems that the community has not sought and the state has not compelled. What you end up with is a generation of Australians who are legally invisible in their own country, not because anyone erased them, because no one wrote them down in the first place. This is where the tone shifts. Because the previous communities found ways to be left alone, this one actively worked to make sure they stayed that way. Somewhere in the vast interior of Western Australia, a community has spent years systematically feeding false information about its location to anyone who asked. Journalists who made inquiries received coordinates that placed the settlement several hundred kilometers from where it actually was. Ex-members who'd had falling outs were given an address for correspondence that doesn't correspond to any real location. Locals in nearby towns were told consistently that the group had moved on years ago. This is deliberate, it's organized, and it works, because the geography helps. The interior of Western Australia is enormous in a way that's hard to really feel, unless you've been there. 100 kilometers in the wrong direction isn't an inconvenience, it's effectively a wall. What takes this beyond mere privacy is the architecture behind it. The misinformation wasn't spontaneous. Someone, or a group of someones, sat down and thought through the problem of being found and designed a system to prevent it. That level of strategic thinking implies something. Either a community that has genuinely thought deeply about its own vulnerability, or a community that has specific reason to believe it would not be safe if located. Both explanations are possible. Neither is reassuring. There's a place in the interior of Tasmania where you cannot make a phone call, cannot access Wi-Fi, cannot receive or transmit on any commercial frequency, not because of geography, but because the people who live there have built it that way. The community organizes itself around a core belief that electromagnetic exposure is not incidental to modern civilization's dysfunction, but central to it. that the steady saturation of the environment with artificial frequencies has had cognitive, social, and biological effects that mainstream institutions are unwilling to acknowledge, because acknowledging them would require dismantling the economic structure those institutions depend on. They monitor the perimeter. They have equipment, sophisticated equipment, which is interesting given their rejection of the connected world, that detects any unauthorized electromagnetic emission in the surrounding area. Visitors, on the rare occasions they're permitted, are required to leave all devices behind. Not in a bag at the gate, physically behind, elsewhere, before arrival. This is not, it's worth being clear, a community of uneducated people who stumbled onto a fringe idea. Several members are documented as having had substantial professional backgrounds in medicine and engineering before joining. Their epistemology, the internal logic by which they decide what is true and what is contamination, is coherent within its own framework, which is part of what makes it difficult to dismiss, and part of what makes it impossible to verify from outside. Not every community on this list was founded on ideology. Some of them were built from wreckage. In the flood-prone river systems of Queensland, there are families who have now been displaced 2, 3, or 4 times by major inundation events. They rebuilt after the first flood, rebuilt again after the second, and somewhere after the 3rd or 4th time standing in the ruins of something the state had promised was covered, was protected, was insured, was safe, they made a different kind of calculation. They stopped rebuilding in the same place, and they stopped trusting the system that had repeatedly failed to protect them. What emerged, in several cases, is small clusters of families who relocated to high ground outside any flood risk zone, outside any council boundary where possible, and began constructing something that the next disaster couldn't reach. Not just physically, systemically. No reliance on grid power that floods knock out. No dependence on supply chains that floods cut off. No trust in insurance systems that flood claims had already taught them were designed to deny rather than pay. These communities aren't ideological in any formal sense. They don't have a philosophy about the state. They have evidence about the state, repeated, personal, material evidence, and they responded to it rationally. The withdrawal wasn't a choice. It was a conclusion. What stays with you about these groups is how ordinary the origin story is. Disaster, failure, repetition of failure, decision. That's a sequence that's not hard to imagine yourself inside. What comes next isn't a place. It's a structure. Spread across the border region between Victoria and New South Wales, there is, depending on who you ask, and most people won't, a network of families and small groups that function as a single community without ever being a single location. They communicate on frequencies that aren't commercially assigned. They share resources across the network: food, medical supplies, mechanical skills, and something that might best be described as collective intelligence about the outside world. There is no headquarters, no leader, no address anyone can give you. There's a protocol, a set of shared understandings about how the network operates, who makes what decisions, how disputes are handled, but it's not written down anywhere that outsiders have been able to access. The deliberate decentralization isn't an accident of geography. It's a design principle. A centralized community can be identified, approached, pressured. An address can be visited. A leader can be interviewed, investigated, charged with something if necessary. A network with no center has none of those vulnerabilities. You can't shut down something that has no point of failure. That's not paranoia talking. That's systems thinking, applied to human survival. 20 years ago, a large agricultural storage structure in rural South Australia began a slow transformation that, from the outside, would have looked like routine renovation. Extensions added, foundation work, some earth moving. What was actually happening was the conversion of that structure, piece by piece, into an underground facility capable of housing a significant number of people for a sustained period, measured not in days or weeks, but in years. The group that occupies it doesn't use the word bunker. They find it sensationalist. They'd describe what they've built as a resilience infrastructure, a physical expression of a rational response to civilizational fragility. The stores are catalogued, rotated and maintained with the same seriousness you'd expect from people who genuinely believe they may have to rely on them. Medical equipment, seed banks, fuel reserves, reference libraries, physical books, not digital files. The question that's hard to avoid is the specific one. What, exactly, are they preparing for? They won't say precisely. Not to outsiders. But the conversations that have filtered out through people who know people who've been inside suggest a worldview in which the current structure of modern society, supply chains, financial systems, energy grids, institutional governance, is understood not as stable, but as temporally extended instability. Not if it fails. When. And more specifically, when the next cascade begins, the people inside that structure intend to still be there when it ends. That's not a fringe position, actually. Versions of it exist in mainstream risk analysis. The difference is that most people who hold that view don't do anything about it. These people did. This one requires care in how it's described, because what it describes is real and serious. There is a community, documented in the recollections of former members and in the accounts of at least one emergency services worker who encountered its boundaries, that, over a period of many years, has developed and maintained a system of internal justice. Disputes handled within. Violations of the community's norms addressed internally. Sanctions applied by the community's own process. No police have been called from within this community in any incident anyone can confirm. No ambulance has been requested. No legal matter has been referred to any external authority. Not because nothing has happened, but because, whatever has happened, the community has dealt with it by its own rules, under its own process, without reference to the state's legal framework. This is, legally speaking, a significant thing. Australian law doesn't recognize parallel justice systems. Events that would constitute crimes under Australian law don't stop being crimes because a private community has processed them differently. And yet, what's worth sitting with, before any judgment, is the underlying question. For a community to build its own mechanisms of accountability and repair, rather than turning to the states, something has to have made the state's mechanisms feel unavailable, unsafe, or insufficient. That's not usually a theoretical position. That's usually a history. What that history is, in this case, is not fully known. Perhaps that's the point. The people in this community were born in Australia. Their parents were born in Australia, in many cases. They live on Australian land, breathe Australian air, drink water drawn from Australian aquifers. They have no identity documents issued by the Australian state. Not because their documents were lost, not because they're refugees or undocumented migrants, because they are the children and grandchildren of founders who made a decision, long ago, not to register any births, any deaths, or any of the legal events that, in the eyes of the state, constitute a human life. A generation has now grown up inside that decision without ever having had the choice to make it themselves. They are not recognized as citizens. They cannot vote, own property in their own name, access Medicare, obtain a passport, open a bank account, or do most of the things that formal citizenship makes possible. And yet they are here. They exist. They work. They form families. They build things. What does it mean to be a human being on a territory whose government does not acknowledge that you exist? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a practical one with no clean answer. Because the community isn't asking to be recognized. Recognition would mean engagement with the same system their founders decided was not worth the cost. They've built a life that doesn't require citizenship. The question is whether that life is sustainable across another generation and the generation after that. And the question under that question, which is harder, is whether the state has any obligation to people who have actively chosen to remain outside its jurisdiction. Or whether the choice, made by the first generation, is one that the third generation can still meaningfully be said to have made. There are no verified coordinates. No satellite image confirms permanent structures at any single location. No census record, no birth registration, no death notice, No electoral absence, because you can only be absent from a list if someone expected you to be on it. What there are instead are accounts. A traveler in the far interior who, after a mechanical breakdown, was found and assisted by a group of people whose camp she described as organized and extensive. She was given food, water, and a repaired vehicle, and was asked in a way she describes as courteous but absolutely unambiguous, not to share the specific location of what she'd seen. A former emergency services worker who describes being redirected by community members during a search operation, redirected with efficiency, with apparent knowledge of the official search protocols, and with an understanding of radio frequencies that implied long experience monitoring them. Several former residents of other off-grid communities who speak obliquely of knowing about a group further out, a group that has been there longer than most. That has a philosophy, not just a practice, around the question of invisibility. That understands disappearance not as a trauma response or an eccentric preference, but as a political right. 30 years by some accounts, maybe longer. What this community is said to believe, and this is drawn from second-hand accounts, which must be stated clearly, is that the relationship between a person and a state is consensual in a way that modern states have stopped acknowledging, that a human being can, through consistent and sustained refusal of all state services and state recognition, effectively withdraw consent from the jurisdiction, that this is not illegal because it is prior to law, that it is not evasion because there is nothing to evade. Whether that philosophy is defensible is a different conversation. What's harder to dismiss is the question underneath it. If a community of people exists, has existed for decades, and no instrument of the Australian state has been able to locate and count them, are they inside Australian jurisdiction or outside it? The answer most legal scholars would give is inside, regardless. Jurisdiction follows territory, not consent. But here's what stays with you. After everything else in this video has settled, the people in that community, if they exist, have already answered that question differently. And so far, at least, no one has managed to prove them wrong. We talk about maps as if they're neutral, as if the act of mapping is just observation, careful, scientific, indifferent. But a map is always also a claim. It says, this is what exists, and this is what matters, and this is what belongs to us. Every map is, in some sense, a political document. The Australian interior is, officially, known territory. Catalogued, surveyed, administered. There is no square kilometre of that land that is, legally, outside the reach of the state. And yet, there are people living in it, dozens of communities, maybe more, across this countdown and beyond it, who have decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that the map was wrong, that the claim it made was false, or broken, or insufficient, that whatever the state was offering wasn't worth the cost of being seen. Some of them fled disaster, some fled ideology, some fled nothing more dramatic than a quiet accumulation of disappointment, and some, the ones at the end of this list, seem to have arrived at something closer to a conclusion, that the contract between citizen and state was voided long ago, and that the only honest response to a voided contract is to stop pretending it's still in force. You can dismiss that. Most people do. But the thing about these communities, the thing that doesn't let go, is that they didn't disappear because they were weak. They disappeared because they were decided. And that distinction, somewhere in the silence of the interior, is the one that matters.